Hello, Africans. We are talking aviation once again with an aviation specialist, and he's the global chairman of Fairfax Africa Fund US, Zemedeneh Negatu. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. And the reason I'm talking to him is a story I saw. Every time I see a story about aviation, I turn to him. Kenya Airways terminating its alliance with KLM Air France. Zem, welcome. Good to talk to you again.
Thank you, Victor, for having me back on your program.
What is the reason behind Kenya Airways, or KQ as we like to call it in aviation circles, terminating its alliance with KLM Air France? I thought it had done wonders for Kenya Airways and aviation in Africa.
A very good question. Let me very quickly give you a background on where KQ is. It's normally referred to as Kenya Airways. For the last several years, it's been losing money. It's been losing market share, and which is kind of unfortunate because Kenya has huge potential. It has a huge, one of the largest tourism markets in Africa, a very vibrant private sector business hub for East Africa. So for an airline, a national flight carrier like KQ, not to be able to capitalize on that, there's obviously something that hasn't worked out. So in 2018, they lost a very significant amount of money. 2017, obviously 2019. And this year, for the first half, 6 months of this year, they lost about $132 million, which is understandable. At least this year, all airlines around the world, except for Ethiopian Airlines, have lost money. The only airline in the world that has made money is Ethiopian Airlines. So KQ has been struggling. There are a number of challenges that has faced. I think the way they structure their financing, the aircraft leases, and many of their costs were simply not sustainable. And ultimately, as we speak today, it's in the process of being renationalized. As you know, it was privatized back in the 1990s. 26% share was taken by KLM at that time, which subsequently became Air France-KLM. And then so right now, 48% of KQ is owned by the Kenyan government. And then about 38% is owned by a consortium of banks that were lenders. And about 7.8% is owned by the Air France-KLM consortium. But very soon, all of them will be bought out by the Kenyan government. So it's been struggling. So something had to give. Now, you brought up this subject, the question you asked me, why the termination? Now, obviously, we don't, the details of the agreement they have is confidential, but you can surmise based on the challenges that KQ has faced, they had to take a lot of measures to correct and to put it back on track of profitability and sustainability. And over the years, I mean, as you know, we do a lot of airline deals in Africa. We develop networks and also, of course, providing financing, raising capital for it. So we know how these things are structured. All the years when we looked at their network, for example, I said, wait a second, why is KQ ceding its hub to foreign carriers? Just like Ethiopia, it should be dominating Nairobi. Nairobi should be 70, 80% KQs, just like 85% of Addis departures and arrivals is Ethiopians. KQ should have done that. And so one of the things, and I'm surmising that because when we develop networks, for example, when we worked with Ethiopian Airlines, we had a broad sheet and they could fly anywhere as long as there's a business reason. But you can see, for example, KQ only flies to 3 destinations in Europe, even though a vast majority of Kenya's tourism comes from Europe. All right, so why is it only flying to 3 places? Maybe this alliance that they have is constraining them. What about Asia? They only fly to 3 places in Asia. Why is that? Again, so it sounded like, and maybe I'm wrong, but it sounded like they were a feeder for the alliance as opposed to strategizing and flying wherever they want. Now, this, as I said, I need to be very cautious. I don't have, I'm not privy to their internal document agreements, but you can see by the networks, now, one thing KQ has done well is if you look at their route network, it's primarily an African carrier. They fly to about 30 destinations in Africa, which is good, right? Because the alliance wouldn't go there. Air France-KLM, they have a few destinations of their own in Africa, but where there is, I think, high margin business, which is in the European market, they only fly to 3 places. So we've always assumed in the industry, there's always speculation that they're being constrained. Now, as I said, I'd like for Air France-KLM to correct me or KQ to correct me on this, but from the outside looking in, I think that's probably one of the reasons. Plus, I'm sure there are costs that they have to incur, even though the returns are much lower for staying in that alliance. So that's part of I think, the process of renationalizing, re-strategizing KQ to be on its own. Now, remember, they will still remain in the Sky team. Okay, they're not abandoning or leaving that Sky team. All they're doing from the news, the release that we've seen, is they're terminating the JV. The JV already was suspended for 2020 because of COVID. So this might be a natural progression to completely terminate it in 2021. So this is sort of the scenario that we look at. But as I said, KQ has huge potential. It's just not been able to leverage it to leverage the market. In some countries, they have national airlines that bring in traffic from all over the world because they don't have domestic traffic. KQ has that. By the way, they have Jumbo, which is their low-cost carrier, which is doing fairly well. So it's not for lack of traffic, lack of paying customers, but they were structured wrong financially. They were structured, though, probably the management. A lot of places just wasn't working right. And as I said, if I was the Kenyan government, when I renationalized KQ, I would demand that it be the dominant carrier and develop a strategy to make it a dominant carrier out of NBO. I think that's a key point.
I would agree with you, because I've been reading about Ethiopian Airlines, Rwanda Air opening new routes to US, to Europe, to China. And you are right. It's almost as if KQ was flying cut flowers to the Amsterdam or wherever it is in Europe, but it wasn't benefiting, as you say, from the traffic that eventually ends up in the many destinations in Africa that they have. So are you saying the alternative to being outside, to being inside the alliance with KLM Air France, is that they'll be free to do anything they want and fly to wherever they want without restrictions, and perhaps be able to open routes and compete those routes that are more profitable? Will it be able to take on Ethiopian Airlines toe to toe?
Well. So let's put Ethiopian Airlines aside for a moment, because we're focusing on the European routes and other places where they haven't been able, because Ethiopian is way far ahead of KQ at the moment. But I always recommended that they could complement each other. For example, tourists that go to Kenya for safaris could come to the historical sites in Ethiopia. So actually, I see more complementarity between KQ and ET than I see KQ and Air France-KLM. I mean, they're rivals. KQ and Air France-KLM are rivals, okay?
Right.
It's almost like, again, it's based on experience. I'm not talking about internal, confidential, privy information that I have for KQ, which I don't, but having worked with a lot of carriers, we've done about 14 of these in Africa. So if I'm developing my strategy, if I have a free hand, it's good to have alliances, right? It's good to be in Sky team. It's good to have some special relationship with Air France-KLM, but ultimately, they are your competitors, and they are shareholders, and they're also binding you with a strategic agreement, which from the outside looking in, as I said earlier, looks like they're probably constraining where KQ can fly. However, I just want to compliment the good things that KQ has done lately. For example, in South Africa, as you know, because of the collapse of the SAA, KQ has now set a cargo hub out of OR Tambo and Joburg, which is good to serve Southern Africa. They're retrofitting, I think, one or two of their aircrafts for the pharma uplifting, for the COVID pharma uplifting, cargo uplifting. It's good. I even saw that, this might be a small thing, but they're a good gesture. They're now charging fees for people to come and visit their 737 simulators. Now, a little gesture in there. So they're trying to do everything they can, but at the end of the day, it's an airline that needs a big bump, a big jump, okay? A leap of faith type of strategy without being constrained with a partner. Now, on another final point though, on this topic, is African airlines, to survive, to thrive, to grow, need to create their own alliances within Africa. I think right now we have too many standalone airlines in Africa, just barely surviving, if at all. They're bleeding cash. And the way forward, whether it's for KQ, by the way, Ethiopian Airlines is not a standalone. I mean, it has equity ownership of multiple carriers in Africa. Now, even before it did that, it was already it has 120 aircraft, 4 billion plus revenue. People get confused that, well, when we can do what Ethiopian done, don't forget, ET is an aviation group, both in the structure, from MRO, from Aviation Academy, from everything else. It's an aviation group. On top of that, the airline itself owns the Malawi, Sky in Togo. I mean, you name it. A lot of airlines are partially owned in Ethiopia, in Africa, by Ethiopian Airlines. So maybe the likes of KQ and eventually SAA, when it's revived, and then maybe Nigeria establishing a national flag carrier, they need to think of creating a strong alliances within Africa. Equity swaps could be one of them, but certainly not to think like standalones. And I think KQ has less than, I think it has only about 40 aircraft. I mean, with all due respect, it's very difficult to compete with the big boys when you have just 40 aircraft. Even if you double it in 5 years, I mean, you'll be at 70, 80 aircraft. With the likes of Emirates have 200 plus, Qatar, Etihad, all these, and the Lufthansa and Air France. So I think we really have to have a different mindset in Africa as to how our carriers are going to compete.
All right, you have answered my last question, which was the future of African aviation. Global chairman of Fairfax Africa Fund US, Zemedeneh Negatu, thank you very much for joining us once again. We look forward to talking to you once you're back on African soil, but thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.